Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest coming to us all the way from Ireland. He's on the west coast of Ireland. I usually talk to people who are on the east coast in the Dublin area, but his name is Shaun MacLeod. It's not you're a MacLeod, right? How do you pronounce your last name?
MacLeod.
MacLeod. Oh, MacLeod. Okay, so it's a
MacLeod. As in
MacLeod.
the cloud in the sky. Yeah.
Gotcha. Shaun MacLeod. The title of his book about the Beatles is Behind the Wall of Illusion: The Religious, Occult, and Esoteric World of the Beatles. So, Mr. MacLeod, are you there?
I am. I'm here, William. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for taking time to talk about this subject. You've also written a couple other books about music as well. One's titled Leaders of the Pack, Girl Groups from the 1960s and Their Influence on Popular Culture. That's published out of Roman Littlefield from 2015. And then last year, Phil Spector, The Sound of the 60s, 2017. But tonight we're going to talk about the Beatles. Still an important subject. There's a lot of, like the title of the book says, a lot of religious, occult, esoteric aspects to possibly the most influential music band in history, a global phenomenon. So just to get started, maybe you can talk a little bit about yourself, your background, Shaun, and then, take the listener to where the Beatles came from in Liverpool.
Okay. Well, I'm actually from Dublin, so you're still interviewing an East Coast. Although we don't use the term East Coast and West Coast here. Really, it's just Dublin and everywhere else in Ireland because we're just a small little country. But so I grew up there more or less. I think around the age of 11, I came across the Beatles, and I think it was about a year or so after Lennon had been shot. And anyway, I kind of became a bit obsessed. Even at 11, I became kind of obsessed with the group, and all through my teenage years, into my 20s, through college. And I think really the Beatles for me, they opened up so many other areas. It wasn't just, I became kind of a musician. I became very interested in music. Before that, I was like most, a lot of kids, particularly at this side of the world anyway, you were sent off to piano lessons and things like that. And it was always kind of classical and very, I guess, slightly rigid. You're learning your scales and you're learning all these kind of things. And I didn't really like that, but, your parents make you go and you do that for a couple of years. And I think the Beatles kind of switched me on to just actually wanting to play music and wanting to be a musician. And but they also got me interested in literature in a sense, because the more I read about them, you realised they were kind of quite, even their own lyrics and their own influences were as much literary as they were musical. So I got quite interested in literature, and that led me into philosophy, and then I studied English and philosophy at university, and also I studied music as well, and I had a number of groups growing up. Kind of became a songwriter and did a lot of playing in bands and recording music and doing kind of running recording studios, that kind of thing. And at the same time, still continuing this interest I had with 60s pop culture and pop culture in general, but also philosophy, literature, and everything. So that's where the book kind of is grown out of all of that.
Gotcha. And so this is your third book, and
yeah.
I mean, I think you wrote in your intro, the book is an attempt to explore the spiritual noumenon, like this philosophical term, behind the Beatles. What gave rise to them, what their influence was. But, I mean, they came out of Liverpool, which I think you wrote was the second hardest hit city by the Luftwaffe bombing raid. So I think they kind of came out of this war-torn wreckage of a city. Would you describe that as that?
Yeah, well, I guess as I kind of started to get, as I got older and more interested in certain aspects of philosophy and esotericism, spirit. I guess I don't want to call it spiritualism because it's the same, but interested in things of a super sensible nature. and that led me to a chap called Rudolf Steiner, who I'm not sure how many of your listeners would be aware of Rudolf Steiner, but an incredibly important individual, I think, for the 20th and 21st century. I mean, the guy gave 6,000 lectures on every conceivable subject, from beekeeping to music to architecture to farming to education. We have the Steiner education schools, things like that. But and also a view of history and how we might view history and look at various different people and where they stand in history and how that affects things. And I kind of realised through that I think pretty much most things we think about and are being told about in a way are actually kind of the opposite. And so I wanted to really look at where I was coming from in terms of growing up in the 80s and 90s, and the culture that we had, which is pretty much Anglo-American here in Ireland, what that kind of grew out of. And I suppose for me it kind of grew out of World War II. So the Beatles, pretty much are the result of young people being born out of that chaos. I think really
they have the Steiner schools. The Steiner schools here in the States are referenced as Waldorf schools. Does that sound right?
That's right.
I have Waldorf. A couple of friends actually who taught at one of the Waldorf schools. But so Liverpool, post-war, and Elvis is an influence on the Beatles, and they dressed and they kind of had a what's a teddy boy? A lot of the American audience wouldn't know what that term represents.
I guess you might know the term greaser or something.
Yes,
that famous film of The Outsiders, where the greasers and the Sosas. So a teddy boy is pretty much, in a sense, they're kind of a greaser, somebody who was very much, influenced by that culture of American rock and roll, in a sense, Blackboard Jungle, that kind of rebelliousness. But it's a kind of an interesting phenomenon because it has this mixture of it's a working class, it's born out of kind of working class roots, in a sense. And the Teddy Boys kind of felt a little bit disenfranchised being part of a working class group after the war, that were kind of this huge austerity on them. And they looked back to a time in England or in Britain where it was a little bit more dapper, a little bit more wealthy, and that was the Edwardian period. So they took on that dress really with these long coats, these bottle creeper shoes, they're called, with very thick soles, the hair then combed back in that kind of Elvis or Tony Curtis style. And usually that kind of like choker, bottleneck choker, or whatever they'd wear, which you'd see maybe in the southern states of America, maybe it comes from there. That was what a teddy boy was, but they were kind of aggressive in their attitude towards, people who were not of their kind of group or of their class. And that kind of got a little bit coloured actually in the 70s, when there was a revival of that, and people like Malcolm McLaren, who the manager of the Sex Pistols, kind of took on that Teddy Boys look. So if you look at some Sex Pistols stuff, which maybe your viewers are familiar with, that sometimes Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious wear those kind of long draped jackets, and so there's a kind of a Teddy Boy look, but it's slightly distorted. And that was,
the Beatles were all working class, so they identified with this kind of group a little bit. Would you agree with that?
With the Teddy Boys, well, they would have wanted to be Teddy Boys in the sense of it was a kind of, it was an identity, I guess. It was the first kind of identity that very specific youth identity that grew out of the post-war austerity period. So around 1955, 56. And maybe just at a time when things were kind of beginning to improve for Britain and Europe in a way, I think definitely someone like Lennon, who maybe as a teenager had a lot to prove, saw himself as, and I think really much because if he took on that demeanor, very hard, tough guy demeanor that the Teddy Boy had, and had a violence attached to it or associated with it. Lennon had to kind of, as a teenager, prove that he had some kind of, he wasn't somebody not to be messed with, even though he said himself that he was really shaken inside, but he had to put on this strong exterior. And I guess the other Beatles kind of, went along with the being kids at the time and the association with rock and roll. They became Teddy Boys in a sense as well. So early photographs you'd see of the Beatles where they had their hair, before they got the hair down, it was all combed back in a Teddy Boy
style, right? Yeah. So they had that leather Teddy Boy thing, but they also kind of came out of this something that was different, that it didn't happen in the States, the skiffle music and the Mersey sound. What was skiffle?
The Mersey sound. Well, actually, the Teddy Boys, first of all, they didn't wear leather. That was another group then that came in called the Ton-Up Boys, or the Ton-Up Boys, which was a kind of another version of the rock and roll, rebel thing, and they wore leather, so they looked like Marlon Brando out of The Wild One, or Gene Vincent, and the Beatles. The before they were the Beatles, the Quarrymen, or whatever manifestation they took at that stage, would have worn leather, so they would have moved slightly away from the kind of Teddy Boy dress, and they wore the kind of the Gene Vincent, that kind of leather look. But the Teddy Boys, it was about a suit. It was suits, and gotcha. Actually the real Teddy Boys, you often see this kind of multicolored Teddy Boy nowadays. You'd often see that picture if someone was to Google what a Teddy Boy looked like, this multicolored, like bright blue jackets, or pink and blue suede shoes and that kind of thing. Whereas the actual original Teddy Boy, it was very much black and white, very quite sophisticated look. And there's actually like a culture now today in Britain that now goes back, this kind of regressive, looking back to the 50s, and they really take on this original look of the Teddy Boy. Anyway, the Beatles took on this kind of more leather-clad rocker kind of look, I suppose. So
right, when those were their German days. Hamburg, I think they were into that kind of look, yeah.
So when they went to Germany, they kind of had that slightly that look. Yeah, that's right.
And so, can you define what skiffle is? Kind of like
skiffle,
a simple type of music that influenced them, right? And Jimmy Page too. Jimmy Page was a skiffle player.
Yeah, well, I think suddenly when Elvis hit, like anywhere, I guess, it was a huge thing for I can only imagine it was like, look, if you look at pictures of Elvis when he in '56, I think you can still see that energy of this kid, basically. That's like that he fell from outer space, I personally, particularly think around that time in America, people may disagree with me, but I think for the youth culture, Elvis and Brando, and probably Dean as well, but they just had this kind of something totally new that no one had ever seen before, and I think Elvis really it just comes at you, and I think you wrote.
You wrote that Elvis was the Beatles' Messiah. Like that's the way they viewed them.
Well, McCartney said he saw a picture of him. He said, "This is it. The Messiah has arrived." So that's very interesting. I mean, that's what I was trying to look at in those early chapters about rock and roll. It was like the youth of the day had decided, in the mid-50s, had decided that the religions that they had grown up with, mainly Protestant, Catholic, that's the kind of background Liverpool was. But that kind of conventional, traditional religion, they had decided, well, if that's going to get us into world wars and get us blown up and that kind of thing, well, who needs it? And, I think the youth, it was like they were kind of waiting for something. That's the impression you get,
right.
That they were waiting, something was going to happen and they knew it. And when Elvis came, they kind of knew, right, this is it, he's here. And you can only imagine seeing a picture as a 15-year-old of somebody who looked like that. I don't think we can even imagine what it was like unless because we've got so much stuff now today, you know, that back then when they had nothing, you know, and particularly in England, they probably didn't even have TVs. Yeah, I mean, TVs only came in '56 when the Queen was coronated. But if you could imagine seeing something like that, it just could, you know, be like someone coming down from outer space. I can only imagine, and that effect that it must have had on a 15-year-old, you know. Right. And I mean, they didn't have music stores, they didn't have guitars, they didn't have really anything, you know. They were very Britain, unless you were upper class, and then they weren't interested in those things. They had their own traditions, and it would be like go to classical music concerts and go to the theatre and playing polo and things. So working class kids didn't really have much. I don't think they had a radio and they had the street outside their door to kick a football around in. So when this guy came along, Elvis, you know, they all rushed out and tried to get guitars, and there was the famous like ads in the back of magazines, you know, play like Elvis, our guitar is guaranteed not to crack, you know, these cheap guitars that they could buy. But I think Elvis at the same time, and the rock and roll heroes that came with like Buddy Holly, Little Richard, you know, these kind of nearly semi-religious figures for the teenagers of the 50s, along with Brando and Dean, and the cinema was like a church for these guys, you know. It was like, you know, they had nothing else. They just really had nothing. It's only 50 years ago or so. So, 70 years ago, maybe, 60, 70 years ago. So these guys had nothing, and suddenly these figures started to appear. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Elvis. You know, it must have been just amazing for a kid at that stage. But Skiffle, it was quite threatening, I think, for the young English boys, you know. And so when Skiffle came, it was an English guy called Lonnie Donegan, who, if you looked at him now, you just think, who's this guy? You know, he just looks like, you know, your granddad or something. But he had a success. He had a big hit with a song called Rock Island Line, was the title, and that was a big hit. It was just a kind of real, like, you know, a very energetic song, and the way Donegan sings it and performs it was kind of full of this energy. So and it was just basically Skiffle is, you've got an acoustic guitar, you've got one of these, you've got a you know, it's a bit like what they call bluegrass or something. It was a mixture of all these things. So it actually came mostly from America, and it was just a mixture of this, maybe some kind of English music hall, they call it, and just a mishmash of stuff with a little bit of kind of rock and roll in there as well. Yeah. And the kids just felt, well, we can play that. Rock and roll is kind of too daring, exciting, too musical in a way. So, you know, they got these, you know, the tea chests with the broomstick, and they put a string on it, and that was their bass guitar, and they got maybe a washboard, very much like the bluegrass thing, whatever they could find, pots and pans.
Right, interesting.
So that's what they played, and that was a bit kind of homemade instruments, and they just, you know, shake, rattle, and roll, basically, just make a sound, and just the kind of the enjoyment to do that. And loads of skiffle groups just suddenly appeared everywhere, and the Beatles' first band, the Quarrymen, was basically a skiffle band. And basically, if you look at those very early pictures of Lennon and the Quarrymen, they look like, again, quite new looking for Britain at the time, but a very American. You know, I mean, Lennon looks like he's just stepped out of at 15 some kind of, you know, American scene.
Right, his hair's all greased up, yeah. That's what
and he has this check shirt on, rolled up at the sleeve, to the arms, and it's a very American, I think, yeah.
But they really kind of defined or developed their style in Germany, even their look. Like you wrote, what I didn't know was that their haircut, you know, became known as the Beatles cut, but they actually got that from an art society in Hamburg. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, yeah. I mean, I'm you know, because you're saying you didn't know there, so I'm thinking, oh God, yeah. I mean, because I know this is all stuff I've known since I was a kid, so I always kind of think, you know, you think, oh, everybody knows this, but yeah, they went to Germany because in Liverpool there was quite so many bands, and there was like a lot of people who maybe tried to, like managers and agents who tried to cash in on that. And they would have places like, mainly in Germany, you still have them today, for example, in Spain, and these holiday resorts where bands get taken over from Ireland or England and they go and play in these places, and they can make quite good money because for a season, the summer, and they meet lots of girls, and they just get involved in the party atmosphere that's around there. But this particularly, these agents had these clubs in Germany, in Hamburg, and the Beatles, who weren't particularly liked by any of the other musicians in Liverpool. I don't think they were particularly thought of to be particularly good. And if anyone wants to really witness how bad the Beatles were, actually, I think that Beatles Anthology Volume 1 really gives a sense of, my God, these guys are just not really good at all.
Wow. And
how they flowered is very interesting. But they went over to Germany, I think more because they had the personality they could kind of schmooze their way in, or blag their way is an expression we use here.
Mm-hmm.
They could just manage to talk their way into these things, and they came over and they got, I think, probably more than the other Liverpool groups. They just had the kind of personality and the character to just get on with people and make them laugh and do crazy things, and they just really tried to become good. I mean, there's obviously a potential there, and it started to flower when they were in Germany. But they met a group of people, these art students, called the X's, and they were kind of just taken by this group, and they had their hair all down. They were called X's because they were into kind of existentialist philosophy and art.
Right.
And
EXIS.
EXIS, yeah. And they wore these polo neck shirts and leather jackets. And I think for some reason, and probably, again, the intuitiveness, I think, definitely of Lennon and McCartney to realise that there was something about their look, and they changed the teddy boy look or the rocker look or whatever, kind of realising, suppose, that they, intuitively that something was changing, and this was it. This was part of that change, because when they got their hair down like that, the mop top Beatle cut, George Harrison kind of disowned the two guys for a short while. He said, I'm not going to lose my
right.
my
greaser ball back.
Yeah, and so. That was the beginning of it, and that is quite an interesting period as well, I think, William, because if you could only imagine, I mean, that's around 1958-9 that they're in Hamburg. I think maybe 60, is it 60? It's around that time, and but only 15 years before that, Germany and Britain were bombing the hell out of each other.
Right.
And I mean, Germany, let's not forget that Germany was as badly bombed as anywhere in Britain. I mean, they really got hammered by the British. So you just had this suddenly, people who were two sworn enemies, really, and not only that, they had been already in a world war, 30 years before the Second World War. So now you suddenly had these kids, this next generation, exchanging clothes and haircuts and fashion, and listening to each other's music and talking about art and literature and stuff. So personally, I think that was a really important thing to happen.
Well, I would agree with you. I think that probably laid the seeds for the 60s, because they realized they didn't want to go back to war. They were in Germany. They had seen the damage in the feud. They weren't not wanting to return that. And actually, the Beatles lost one of their members and stayed in Germany, Stuart Sutcliffe, right? So he ended up marrying the girl who influenced their haircut.
Yeah, that's right. And then he sadly died just shortly after they got married, I think. Yeah.
He got in a fight or something and had an aneurysm.
Well, there's a lot of question marks over that, all right. Yeah, some people claim that Lennon actually beat him up, and that's why he got the brain hemorrhage. Others that they got into a fight. Others that he just didn't really take care of himself. He used to stay up all night painting. He was a very, very good artist, and I've seen some of his work. And it's begun to have like a life of its own outside of that association with the Beatles. I think a lot of people are recognising the real talent that was there. But and then he'd be playing in band with the Beatles at night, and then painting, and then they were taking a lot of amphetamine substitutes, I think Preludin, which they would take to keep them going for hours, because they would have to play for 8 or 9 hours, I think, in these clubs. Very, very long stretches into the middle of the night. So he was doing that, and then he was painting. And so whether he got beaten up or didn't get beaten up, there's just seems to be lots of different stories around that. Whether Lennon in a fit hit him. This is one of the stories. Actually, Sutcliffe's sister claims that Lennon beat him up, and that's why he died. Others say that never happened, and so I don't know exactly, and that's another interesting connection, aspect. But I don't know the definite thing. But he died anyway of a brain
aneurysm. Yeah, I think they called it.
Yeah, and I think also, William, he didn't. The doctor knew it was there, and they gave him advice on, look, you need to have a more stable lifestyle, and he didn't really take the advice. That's another story, and then so it just got worse. So,
gotcha. So that was kind of the beginnings of the Beatles. When did they really kind of turn from a small band playing in Hamburg into this huge Beatlemania? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I guess I just wanted to kind of say there first, William, is like, the whole point of the book, the religious, esoteric, and occult world of the Beatles, is the first 2 chapters that we've just kind of looked at there. What I'm really trying to explore in those is that kind of the religious fanaticism in inverted commas, that very, very strong feeling, belief, or something that rock and roll seemed to give to these young people, and people like Elvis and others, but particularly Elvis, as a kind of a messianic figure for them. And even now, when we talk about Sutcliffe there in a deeper sense, it's quite possible, because he seems to kind of still follow them through their career. You can feel the influence of his death, I think, at times. You can feel it, the presence there, even in those early photographs, because Sutcliffe was actually the first to take on that look. He was the first. Astrid cut his hair like that, and eventually Lennon and McCartney followed. Gotcha. And he appears on the Sgt. Pepper's album. So in some kind of strange way, I mean, it's a little bit like, for another proper cultural reference, when Ben Kenobi in Star Wars decides consciously to give his life up, and then he follows Luke, in a sense, in some kind of,
spirit
non-physical world. He's there with him. And I often get that feeling that, I don't think Stuart Sutcliffe consciously did that, but somehow there seems to be a feeling of that there.
But didn't Lennon say that Sutcliffe was with him, or he remembered Sutcliffe all the time?
There's that feeling always that he's still there, and the same, I think, with Lennon's mother, who had died earlier that year before Sutcliffe, and even McCartney's mother, who died when he was 12. Again, you always at times get the feeling that those people are still present there somehow. And maybe that is something that, people do feel when they've lost people, that they're still there with them, or they've gone through a difficult time, and they say, well, I felt, that person, that my mother who passed on, or my sister or brother or something, was there helping me through it. And so sometimes maybe this is a necessary thing, that maybe there's an element of someone sacrifices themselves here to be of value on the other side of the veil or the threshold. I'm not saying that's true.
That's basically saying, Christian theology, right? Christ died, sacrifice.
Yeah, that would be very
similar.
Yeah, that would be, and that would very much be again this aspect of Rudolf Steiner's philosophy that we don't it's not finished here. We pass over, and we still have an influence in this world, and so lots of things like that. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So he had a reincarnation. Was Steiner's views consistent with general Christian views, or was he more of a Eastern? That's interesting too, because we're going to get into the Beatles and their influence from the East. Where did Steiner get his ideas?
Well, do you want to go back and talk about the Beatlemania thing?
Yeah,
first,
let's do it. We don't have to talk about Steiner. That's a secondary thing. I think we should talk about Beatlemania.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, from the point of view of the religion, I think when the Beatles suddenly became this huge phenomena, which they did first in England, and some people say, well, it was that they were used as a distraction. There was a number of events going on politically in England at the time. One was the Profumo scandal, where a British member of Parliament,
Christine Keeler.
Christine Keeler. He was the Minister for Defence. He was seemingly with a call girl called Christine Keeler, who was associated with some quite dark, dark figures in a way. Stephen Ward being one of them.
Ward was a black magic practitioner.
It seems to be something like that. Yeah, that seems to be the case. So this, and then she was also involved with the Russian diplomat,
right?
And so this whole thing came out, and this idea of a Minister for Defence with a call girl who's got an association with a Russian diplomat does not good. Caused a scandal in Parliament, and the real scandal was actually because he had lied about his association with Keeler, and then it turned out that he said he didn't know her, and then it turned out he did. He said he lied, and that was like, our politicians are lying to us, and etc. etc. So this whole scandal happened. Lots of stuff came out. People ended up committing suicide, and it was very dark, a bit like the Kennedy thing in America. And I think some people claim they just looked at something, they went, oh, here's something that we can just distract everybody with, and that was the kind of Beatles were beginning to have some kind of popularity. I don't buy that, really. I think the Beatles were a kind of a phenomenon that were destined to happen, but these other events needed to happen too in order for the whole thing. Nothing happens in isolation.
Right. And
so that was the first thing in England, I think, and it spread across Europe. Why really? I mean, there's loads of bands in England, in Liverpool, that there's some kind of really good documentaries about that scene at the time, and you can see all these bands playing, really excellent bands. Why the Beatles suddenly were the ones that were I mean, most of those went to Liverpool, to Hamburg as well, so they went through the same, how might you say, kind of processes to develop the same development. But I think the Beatles did seem to have just some edge for some reason. And I think even strangely, just the way they looked on stage, when you looked at them, Lennon and McCartney being left-handed, Lennon being right-handed, and Harrison being right-handed, they created just when you look at them, this kind of symmetrical thing, that the other bands didn't have. And they didn't seem to have that same harmonies that Lennon and McCartney would have, the sweet with the rough, and they just seem to have something a little bit more, I think, maybe than the others. And also I think possibly it was just kind of their destiny. They had the personality types as well, and I think in Hamburg as well, like Ringo Starr joined pretty much them, not as a full-time member, but that's where they got to know him, and he would play with in the group, and I think they felt his personality suited more than the drummer they had, Pete Best, who was then, removed from them, and Ringo came in, and suddenly this whole unit just was created. And so by the time we got to America, Beatlemania had just, again, you had the kind of the Kennedy, the situation with the death of Kennedy or the assassination of Kennedy, which maybe left a hole in the psyche of the American people for the time, and they needed something to fill it. And here with these kind of, strange-looking guys from England shaking their heads and singing these kind of, not too unusual. I mean, they were basically copying American rock and roll, but they had a slight, I suppose, there was a slight Englishness to them and their accents and all this, and why it just took off into Beatlemania. But again, I think it's probably the youth of the time just needed something to, maybe a sense of hope, maybe a sense of, resurgence or, regeneration, and that came with the Beatles, and because of that, they were seen nearly as, I think, kind of saviors for the young people in America who maybe had lost hope, I think, when Kennedy was assassinated.
Right. I think that the Kennedy died November 22nd, 63, and you said Beatlemania started in October, so it was right there, literally overlapping with the murder of Kennedy.
Yeah, and actually I think someone pointed out, which I mentioned in that book, that they're with the Beatles album, the second album, which was basically the start of the Beatlemania in Britain, was released the same day Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
And that's an interesting.
Well, that's an interesting phenomenon, because Kennedy died on that day, Huxley died on that day, C.S. Lewis died on that day, and now the Beatles dropped their second album on that day. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So you seem quite familiar there. I mean, I listened to some of your interviews earlier, William, on the Crowley thing and things like that. So you've kind of got quite a good background in that whole area as well.
I mean, his influence. My book, Children of the Beast, covers his influence on so many musicians: Jimmy Page, Jim Morrison, a little bit of the Beatles. You talked about the semaphores, them making those magical signs that go back to, I think it's the grades within the Golden Dawn system. So, the Beatles had stuff, but there were certain things they said that they were magic. I have to go back and look at the original writings, because that one statement that you had where they say something, those particular molecules formed to make these four guys, the Beatles, I have to think there was something metaphysical, something alchemic, something that must be thought of as magic, because when I read that, it was magic with a K, which is Crowley's style, magic. Yeah. But I included that quote in my book too. So, I was familiar with some of the stuff. I learned a lot from your book, that's for sure. I didn't know how much of the Leary. There were two songs that the Beatles were influenced by Timothy Leary, who thought he was actually living Crowley's life. He thought that his ideas and his outlook were some type of spiritual resurgent. And there's a famous quote from Leary where he says, Crowley, I'm here carrying on Crowley's work. I wish he was here in the 60s to see this day. So you have to see, I think you wrote that excellent chapter 4, the Dionysian, Apollonian duality, the Dionysian aspects of the Beatles, and how I think that you're right, that was the resurgence of this ideal that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. I mean, because you can see, you wrote about it in your book, that these people are going crazy. Women are going crazy. They literally would have tore the Beatles to shreds if they could get their hands on them. All kinds of very, deranged people. And the men would like the Beatles too, right? So I think it's really an important aspect. But what was also interesting about the Beatles too, maybe you can talk about this, how these books that Lennon was writing and how he got in trouble saying they were bigger than Christ, but this book that he wrote or read about, what was the name of it? About that, I can't remember the title of it, but the Bible.
The Passover.
Passover.
Yeah.
Right, yes.
Yeah, well, on the Dionysian thing, I think, Nietzsche talks about this in The Birth of Tragedy, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. And I don't think it's necessary, the Greeks had it manifested in the Apollonian, Dionysian. One is the
duality or dialectic.
Yeah, the duality of the human being, really. The psyche. One, the Apollonian from the god Apollo, connected to the sun, and this kind of awake consciousness. We're awake, and we need to control these forces that are subconscious, and that's obviously very important, because if we didn't have that, we would be just out of control. But I think Nietzsche's point is, if that became dominant in modern Western culture, and that leads into things like what we call a very logocentric view of the world, and logos there we could connect to Christ, but I think also to the idea of the written word,
right.
And logic. And when we see it in schools, for example, kids are just left, it's reading and writing, and they're sitting in the school in the chair all day long, going crazy, because it's only one aspect of the human being. And if that dominates, we become kind of stale, bored, we lose our imagination, we become frustrated. The written word, which becomes set in stone, becomes all powerful, whereas in reality things change all the time. So, so what Nietzsche is trying to say is we need to release this as well. We need the Dionysian, because we need that part of ourselves. And so when I think this youth after the war, this subconscious element started to really manifest itself, because without it, you do end up with you end up going crazy, just blowing each other up, because there's nowhere for this energy to go. And I think the Beatles, in a way, brought that out of. They allowed people to do that. And they also allowed the whole thing with Dionysus was people who were from outside were able to be taken, were accepted in the society. It was kind of a Dionysian festival that the Greeks would have, where these, what they call the mad women, the maenads, would go crazy, and they would tear the god apart, and they would drink wine, and they would dance, and then the people in that festival would come out of it regenerated. They would go through some kind of process where they would suddenly kind of know themselves better. And I think that seemed to happen when you read reports of, particularly I think in America, of young girls feeling that their lives in America were boring. They didn't know what they were, it was just dull suburbia, which the post-war had brought mainly to America, I think, because you suddenly had, like, after the, when all that energy was gone into making weapons, it was suddenly now gone into making cars and washing machines and dishwashers and TVs.
Consumerism, yeah.
And that created consumerism, and then you had, like, suburbs where houses were built, and that obviously helped the economy, and in that sense was good, but supermarkets and blah blah blah, and there obviously seemed to be a reaction to that, where you get with the Beat Poets and the Road movie, and just I want to escape this,
right?
The America always that land of adventure and the Wild West and new frontiers, that was kind of gone. It was just, well, this is it now. You're just stuck out in the middle of nowhere, and you've got a big shopping mall, and you got your car to drive in and out of work, and so you can imagine kids were just going, I'm just bored, and suddenly again, these people from England came over with their funny look and their slightly strange sound and their dress and their the way they dressed, and this European and English coming over, and the energy, the amplification of the instruments, etc. And kids could just suddenly, and the kids had the liberty to now go wild, because the parents gave it to them, because the parents had gone through war,
right?
And well, let the kids live. We went through a war, so let's enjoy our lives over here. And also the threat of that bomb hanging over everybody, right. So they're just like, well, let's just live it up now. So I think that they allowed all those forces to come out. And that led to a lot of things. It might not have been good in some ways, but it did lead to, I think, or it definitely helped things like the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, people becoming more aware of who they were and that kind of thing. So it was a real liberation and a real kind of rebirth in some ways, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the 60s were really something else, and the Beatles, whether they caused or whether they rode that unconscious, subconscious thing. I think it's kind of like a double helix, they kind of worked
Yeah.
together. So, but it's interesting
Yeah.
because Lennon, he always thought that there was like cosmic influences and things coming to him from elsewhere, right? I mean, did he say, what did he say? Their music and lyrics channeled through them contain magic and messages from beyond the mind, right?
Yeah, he said a lot of things, but I think always, I think what's interesting about them is, like most people, living in a kind of what some philosophers might call, the naive consciousness. They just think, well, this is everything that it is. I get up, I go to school, and then I go to get a job, and then I get my house, and I get married, and have kids, and the idea of being financially secure. If I get lots of money, I'll be happy. And I think these, it started like that with the Beatles. It's kind of like, right, if we get rich and we get famous, then we'll be happy. And then they get rich and famous, and they beyond what most people could imagine, and what they were able to actually cope with. And I think pretty much within a year, I get the impression within a year, definitely Harrison and Lennon were going, this is, I've had enough of this. It's just crazy. I can't leave. I'm trapped in it. I can't leave the hotel. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. People are pulling at me. People think I have some kind of answers to their problems. And if anybody's ever kind of had situations where they, are dealing with people's problems, after 2 or 3 people telling you all their problems and wanting you to fix it, and not actually quite knowing what their problems are, but wanting you to fix it. And because I've had it myself, various different things. It just is so. You're just going, I can't. I'm only a guy who can just barely get through the day myself. I can't fix your problem. So I could only imagine somebody like Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, who were considered to be, that song, that just, you must know everything. You must have the answers for me, and you must be able to fix everything for me, and you've got everything that I want, so I want to be part of you. I can just imagine it just must have really just sent them crazy, because how can you, it's like if you've got one of those friends who keeps ringing you up on the phone all the time, going, oh, such and such happened, or I had a fight with my girlfriend again. You've heard the story for the 50th time. You're just thinking, what can I do? I can't listen to the story anymore, and I can't help you because it's your problem, to solve. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a kind of, it's your problem, so leave me alone. But you can't solve someone else's problems. They have to solve it for themselves. So that must have just gotten really draining. Not being able to go down the street must have gotten really draining. Suddenly they realise, hang on a sec, what I thought I wanted is actually not what I wanted. But then they're stuck in that because they go, well, what else can I do?
Right.
And possibly all the benefits that actually do come with that, it's very hard to let go of it. So you kind of now have a slight addiction. You have an insecurity. You're also, in a sense, you've got other people who are dependent on you to be in the group. You've got other people who are dependent on their livelihood because you're in it. Right. Elvis, I think, really felt this because at the last days of his life, when he's overweight, he's on all sorts of drugs, he can hardly stand, and he still has to go and do these Vegas shows because so many people, if he's not there, they've lost their jobs, they can't provide for their families.
Right.
So that burden of responsibility, we talked about Christ earlier, and I think people don't really understand, from my perspective, so that burden that being carries, it's just so immense. So someone like a person who's just a normal person, Lennon, McCartney, or Elvis, they can't really carry it. They can't carry it. It's too much, and people think they can because they think this is our religion, our way. And so I think they went from that to going into, well, there has to be something else. There has to be something beyond what we thought was. Because the human spirit is always moving forward. It's always trying to, it always thinks, it gets to the top of the mountain and then it goes, oh, there's another mountain over there. It keeps striving. It doesn't stop. It just can't, can it?
And that's interesting, and that's kind of what led them into doing a lot of drugs, LSD and stuff like that, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think the drugs were both a release from that. I mean, they meet Dylan. Definitely alcohol was the first, a release from that, and I mean, Starr became an alcoholic. Ringo Starr became an alcoholic, but later on. But when they met Dylan, and Dylan introduced them to marijuana, I think they were smoking it all the time because they went, "Wow, I can sit in my room, and we can just smoke hash, and we can just get away from all of this. We can enjoy ourselves." And so everywhere they went, they were. I mean, you can see that in their interviews. They really look like they're just gone. From about 65, 66. I mean, it's quite funny, but they were just, and by all accounts, interviews and other, things written about them, they were just stoned all the time. So it must have been a release from that, but anyone who's ever smoked marijuana would possibly know that it opens up some other new way of perceiving the world. And so this happened as well, and this, I guess, was fascinating for them. And I think and imagine it must have brought them closer together in a sense because of that effect. That sometimes it's a bit like going drinking with your buddies, like right. It brings you closer together for that time, doesn't it? So
yeah, no doubt.
I think they became more of a kind of a one mind through that, of get even more so than they were before. Different perspective on things. It's something just new, and then that comes into the music, and then that leads into suddenly LSD came along, and that was even more far out.
Right. And then and then you throw in the Eastern mysticism, right?
But I think then they realized, mind expansion's where it's at. Like, we are more than just people living in what I call the naive realist's view of the world. It's not just, a plant is not just a plant. It's all sorts of stuff going on in it. The world we live in is not, things are not just the way we think they are. Because anytime we get involved with, you meet a girl and you think, oh, great, I've met this girl. But then you realize there's so many other aspects. There's their family, there's their friends, there's her job, there's her... Suddenly you go, oh, it's like, there's so many other aspects to just one person.
Right.
That I never... You don't think of until you're in it. And then you either think, well, this is working for me, or like, no, I can't deal with their parents or their friends or her way she is when you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah, definitely, 100%.
Yeah, so I think they suddenly started to realize that what we've been told, because we're all told it. We've all been told it as part of consumer society. We're still told it today that you go out there, you work hard, you make your money, and you'll be happy. And then you realize, well, it's just a way of keeping you on this kind of treadmill. If you're the lucky one, that. Yeah, and I think they realized that, and I think they went, there's something more than there has to be. And whether it was the influence of the marijuana and the LSD that scrambled their minds a little bit, I think they genuinely realized and believed, and I suppose it's for me a belief too, that there is something more than just the physical material world we live in. And
Shaun, we're coming down to the end of the hour right now. We've done 53 minutes. It's gone fast.
Oh God.
We have covered all the first. The good news is that we're not going to reveal all the other great stuff in the book. You discuss the supposed death of Paul McCartney. You also discount the Adorno influence upon the Beatles that was propounded by Coleman, the Committee of 300. So there's a lot of other stuff left in the book, which is great because I do recommend people find the book and read it. Again, the title of the book is Behind the Wall of Illusion, the occult, the religious, occult, and esoteric world of the Beatles. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap this hour up?
Well, just so much, but I guess there's two things. I mean, I would have really liked to have chatted more a little bit about the Crowley thing and things like that, but I would like to just talk about, I think this occult aspect of the book, which is, where, because the esoteric, really what I'm talking about are these kind of spiritual forces that played a part, or like I feel played a part. And that's very much, I come from Rudolf Steiner's perspective of, this things that happen in the physical world are very much a manifestation of other things that are going on in a non-material, or what he often refers to as the super sensible world. And that would be something I'd really like to talk about, but we just don't have any time, obviously. But the occult part of it is really, I think and you find it a lot on, as you probably know, William, these a lot of conspiracy sites and channels and things like that, of which I'm hugely interested in, and I think there's a huge amount in that. I know I'm right in saying there's your view of the 9/11 thing and various other things like that. I would be very much aware of, and very much, feel very much that there is very dark forces.
Yes. Yeah.
Behind lots of things.
My first book was Prophet of Evil. It was about Aleister Crowley's influence on 9/11 and the occult aspects. There's all kinds of occult things that happened September, even the numbers and the names, the dates and everything, and the buildings. Just there's a very deep occult aspect to 9/11.
Yeah, I would agree. And actually, I would recommend one person who I mention a lot and who's been very helpful to me. A chap called Terry Boardman, William, who has a lot of. I used to do a lot of talks here in Limerick, people coming over and talking about various things from a slightly alternative perspective. But Terry is a historian who has a huge, really, really huge understanding of history, the actual view of history as it's been told today. He really questions that 9/11. Europe today, Brexit, all of these things, these quite negative forces that are behind that. A character who's very interesting here called Caspar Hauser. It would be worth people looking him up. Some people think he's a mystical character, but Terry does a really good talk on him. 2 films are made about this character, Caspar Hauser.
Well, check
I won't
it out.
tell you any more about that, but that's very interesting.
I think the website is 3man.org. That is the website.
3man.org. Yeah, that's Terry's website. But this occult thing with the Beatles, I would just like to just mention that, because I definitely think there was some occult connections there consciously. I don't think well, as you said, I'm not too convinced with the Adorno and the Committee of 300 thing.
Either am I. It's hard for him to believe that a guy who's in California is, guiding the Beatles. I think he was in California in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I do. There's this. I mean, I do think this kind of what they call the Frankfurt School. There does seem to be something that, unfortunately, in some ways, has quite a negative impact on American culture.
I'd agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think whether this idea that Adorno wrote all their songs, the Beatles songs, whether I just think that's just I don't. How could one? The very distinctive personalities, I think, and they very clearly come out. If anybody's familiar with Beatles music, it's very clear that the personality Lennon comes out in his songs, in McCartney's in his songs, and and Harrison in his songs. I don't think one person could have written all of those things. What I do think is, I think certain black occultists became maybe allowed for them to become famous, because even though I grew up with rock and roll, I grew up with records, and I grew up with all these things, I can see they can have a negative effect, which I think you're seeing more and more today with digital music and people just going around with their headphones on all the time and iPhones and things like that, where they're just locked into their own world.
Right.
So that obviously had to start somewhere. But I don't think they were overly consciously aware of that. And I think that thing with Crowley and stuff like that, as I mentioned, like, even though I think they flirted with that, I think there was a group of people around them in England, an intelligentsia, young people, who were more familiar with Crowley and.
Well, there's a connection between Mark David Chapman and Kenneth Anger. Kenneth Anger actually knew Chapman in Hawaii and visited him or something like that. So there's like the
Right.
guy who wrote Lucifer Rising or made the Lucifer
Yeah.
Rising movie, who had people who, who made the costumes for Lucifer Rising were friends with the Beatles. So that network is there. But we're coming to an end. That was Shaun MacLeod, spelled MacLeod. The book is available at the limerikwritercenter.com. Also available on Smashwords, Kobo, and some other sites. The title again, Behind the Wall of Illusion: The Religious, Occult, Esoteric World of the Beatles.